Sarah's headlights cut through the darkness as her car bumped along the gravel road leading to her grandmother's old house. The evening sky was heavy with storm clouds, and occasional flashes of lightning revealed the gnarled branches of ancient trees lining the path, their leaves rustling as if whispering secrets. She hadn't been back to the house since her grandmother passed away 2 years ago, and the closer she got, the heavier her heart felt. Pulling up to the front of the house, she killed the engine and sat for a moment, staring at the silhouette of the two-story Victorian home against the dark sky. The wind picked up, sending a chill through her as she gathered her courage and her overnight bag from the passenger seat. The house stood as she remembered, though more imposing under the flickering storm. Ivy crawled up the siding, clutching the old stones like ancient fingers, and as Sarah approached, she noticed the front door was slightly ajar. This struck her as odd. Her aunt had assured her the house had been locked up and untouched since the estate had been settled. Probably just the wind, she muttered to herself, pushing the door open with a creak that echoed through the empty halls. Inside, the air was cool and musty, filled with the scent of old wood and lavender, her grandmother's favorite. Sarah flicked the switch by the door. The electricity was still on, thankfully, and the familiar soft glow of the hallway light welcomed her in. She closed the door against the rising wind, which seemed to moan in protest, and locked it firmly. The house was exactly as she remembered. Photos of her family through the ages lined the walls, furniture covered with white sheets to keep the dust off, and her grandmother's old grandfather clock stood silent at the end of the hall. Sarah's gaze lingered on a photograph of her grandmother, standing in this very hallway, a serene smile on her face. It felt like the photo was watching her, guiding her deeper into the house. Dragging her bag behind her, Sarah made her way through the living room and into the kitchen. She set her bag down at the table and pulled out a small flashlight, just in case the power decided to go out with the storm. The house creaked and settled around her as if it were stretching its limbs after a long sleep. As she opened the refrigerator to put away some groceries she had brought, a sudden gust of wind slammed against the house, rattling the windows and sending a stack of old newspapers on the counter fluttering to the floor. Sarah jumped, her heart racing. Laughing nervously at her own fright, she bent down to pick them up, noticing that one of the papers was dated the day after her grandmother's funeral. It was as if the house itself was reliving that day. The wind continued to howl outside, a haunting soundtrack to her return. It seemed to whisper through the cracks and crevices of the house, calling her name in a sighing, melodic tone. Sarah shook her head, trying to dismiss the eerie feeling creeping up her spine. "It's just the wind," she repeated to herself. Setting the newspapers back on the counter, she decided to make a quick inspection of the house to ensure everything was secure. As she walked back towards the hallway, the floorboards groaning under her weight, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The whispers of the wind seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if urging her on. With each step, the atmosphere grew thicker, the shadows deeper, and Sarah could not help but feel that despite the emptiness, she was not entirely alone. With the whispers of the wind still clinging to the edges of her mind, Sarah proceeded up the grand staircase, her hand sliding along the polished wood banister, feeling the familiar grooves and imperfections beneath her fingers. The house groaned under the strain of the storm outside, each gust seeming to shake the very foundations of the building. Lightning flashed intermittently, casting ghostly shadows that danced along the walls, transforming the familiar hallway into a corridor of flickering specters. Reaching the top of the stairs, Sarah paused, a cold draft brushing against her cheek. It was coming from the guest bedroom, the room she had always stayed in when visiting her grandmother. The door was slightly ajar, which was strange. She remembered closing it the last time she had been here, years ago. Pushing the door open, the hinges whimpered softly, protesting the sudden disturbance. The room was shrouded in shadows, the furniture all draped in white sheets, giving the appearance of slumbering ghosts in the dim light. Sarah flicked the light switch by the door, and a soft glow filled the room. With a deep breath, she ventured inside, her eyes scanning the familiar objects now hidden under their ghostly covers. She pulled the sheets off the furniture, revealing the floral patterns of the sofa and the polished surface of the wooden coffee table. Everything was just as she remembered, preserved in a time capsule of dust and silence, except for a thin layer of dust that coated everything, testament to the room's long disuse. She set about making the room habitable, opening the curtains to reveal the storm raging outside. The window panes rattled as the wind assaulted them, but they held firm. The room slowly began to feel warmer, more welcoming, as if it were awakening from a long sleep at her arrival. With the room now somewhat settled, Sarah decided to unpack her bag. She placed her clothes in the ancient oak wardrobe, its doors creaking open with a mournful sound. It was then she noticed a small, leather-bound book lying at the bottom of the wardrobe. Curious, she picked it up, turning it over in her hands. It was a journal, her grandmother's handwriting scrawled across the faded cover. Compelled by a mixture of nostalgia and curiosity, Sarah opened the journal, the pages musty with age. The entries were dated back to her grandmother's youth, filled with tales of daily life, of loves lost and found, and of the deep, spiritual connection she felt with this house. As Sarah flipped through the pages, the wind outside crescendoed, as though reacting to the awakening of old memories. Returning the journal to its resting place, Sarah felt a deep connection to her grandmother, as if through the journal she could communicate with her beyond the grave. The wind seemed to whisper her grandmother's secrets, each gust a word, each howl a sentence in the symphony of the past. Having settled the room, Sarah decided to explore the rest of the house, her grandmother's journal tucked under her arm as a companion. She moved down the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the thick, lush carpet that lined the floor. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch her, their eyes following her every move. It was a gallery of ancestors, each frame containing a piece of her history. As she reached the end of the hallway, Sarah stopped in front of the door to her grandmother's bedroom. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. This was the sanctum of her grandmother, the heart of her mysteries. Taking a deep breath, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was exactly as her grandmother had left it. The bed was made, the linens tight and crisp, and her grandmother's robe lay folded on the chair beside the bed, as if she would return at any moment to claim it. The air was heavy with the scent of lavender and mothballs, a comforting smell that brought back a flood of childhood memories. Walking over to the bedside table, Sarah noticed another journal, this one more worn than the one she had found earlier. Opening it, she discovered it was her grandmother's dream diary, filled with vivid descriptions of dreams that seemed almost prophetic. The entries were cryptic, full of mysterious figures and ominous settings, and as Sarah read, the wind outside mirrored the turmoil in the pages. The house creaked and sighed around her, as if it were alive, reacting to the stir of its long-held secrets. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, the feeling of being watched intensifying. But rather than fear, a sense of determination settled over her. She was here to uncover the truth hidden in these walls, whispered by the wind and written in the journals of a woman who had known far more than she had ever let on. As the storm continued to rage outside, Sarah settled into her grandmother's bedroom, surrounded by the artifacts of her past. Here, she would stay the night, under the watchful eyes of her ancestors, ready to delve deeper into the mysteries that the house and her grandmother had left behind. Sarah spent the remainder of the evening poring over her grandmother's dream journal, her eyes tracing the meticulous, flowing script. Each entry seemed more mysterious and laden with symbolism than the last. With a heavy sigh, she closed the journal, feeling the weight of her grandmother's secret spiritual life pressed down upon her. She glanced at the clock, just past midnight. The storm outside had not abated. If anything, it seemed to crescendo with her every movement. Deciding it was time to retire, Sarah changed into her nightclothes and nestled under the heavy, quilted blankets of her grandmother's bed. The wind continued to buffet the house, the old windows shuddering with each gust. Despite the noise, fatigue from the day's emotional journey began to pull her towards sleep. Just as she was drifting off, a loud thump from above jolted her awake. Her heart raced. She was alone in the house, wasn't she? Holding her breath, she listened intently. There it was again, a thump, followed by what could only be described as footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth directly above her room, in the attic. But that was impossible. The attic was just an old storage space, filled with forgotten relics and boxes of photographs. No one could be up there. Compelled by a mix of fear and resolve, Sarah climbed out of bed. She grabbed the flashlight she had left on the nightstand and cautiously opened the bedroom door. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the flashes of lightning that periodically illuminated the house with eerie, flickering light. The air felt cooler now, the earlier warmth replaced by a penetrating chill. With each step toward the attic stairs, the floorboards creaked ominously under her feet, echoing through the silent house. The whispers of the wind seemed to grow louder, urging her onward. Reaching the pull cord for the attic stairs, she hesitated, her hand trembling. Taking a deep breath, she pulled it, and the stairs unfolded with a groan. The attic was dark, the air stale and musty with disuse. Sarah directed the beam of her flashlight upwards, cutting through the darkness. The attic was crowded with furniture covered in sheets, boxes stacked haphazardly, and trunks filled with old clothes and books. As her light swept across the room, the footsteps ceased abruptly, leaving only the sound of the storm outside. She climbed the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. Reaching the top, she paused, listening. Silence, but for the wind. She stepped into the attic, her flashlight sweeping over old oil paintings, mirrors draped in cloths, and a rocking horse sitting forlornly in the corner. Nothing seemed out of place. Moving deeper into the attic, Sarah noticed a draft. A small window was open, the curtains billowing softly. Had she left it open earlier? No, she hadn't been up here since she arrived. She crossed the room to close it, but stopped midway when she spotted something peculiar. A small, dusty box sitting slightly apart from the others, as if it had been recently moved. Curiosity overcame her apprehension. She approached the box, wiping away the layer of dust. Inside, she found a collection of old letters tied with a ribbon. They were addressed to her grandmother from someone named Eleanor. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, each letter filled with worry and mentions of urgent, cryptic warnings about something hidden within the walls of the house. As Sarah read, the wind seemed to carry the echo of whispered voices, the words indistinguishable but fraught with urgency. She felt a sudden cold spot in the air next to her, the hairs on her neck standing on end. Startled, she dropped the letters, her flashlight beam catching a shadow moving in the periphery of her vision. She swung the light around, but there was nothing, only the piles of old furniture and boxes. Breathing heavily, Sarah gathered the letters, stuffing them back into the box. She decided it was best to investigate these in the morning, under the light of day, away from the unsettling shadows of the attic. As she descended the stairs, the wind seemed to whisper her name, a sigh that trailed her back into the safety of her grandmother's bedroom. Back in bed, she tried to calm her racing thoughts. The storm raged on outside, a symphony of chaos that now seemed in tune with the tumult inside the house. Sarah eventually drifted into a restless sleep, her dreams filled with shadowy figures and whispered warnings, the echoes of the attic footsteps blending with the howling of the wind. Dawn broke with the storm still raging outside, its relentless howl a constant reminder of the night's eerie disturbances. Sarah lay awake, the blankets pulled up to her chin, her mind replaying the strange events in the attic. The shadows, the whispers, the mysterious letters, all of it felt surreal, yet undeniably real. With a deep breath, she resolved to confront the secrets of the house head-on. After dressing and steeling herself with a cup of strong coffee, Sarah made her way back to the attic. Daylight filtered weakly through the storm clouds, casting a dim, gray light that barely illuminated the space. The attic seemed different by day, less menacing, though each shadow still held the potential for secrets or threats. She went directly to the small box of letters she had discovered the night before. This time, she examined each one carefully, spreading them out around her as she sat cross-legged on the dusty floor. Each letter was dated back several decades, during the prime of her grandmother's life. Eleanor, the author, wrote with increasing urgency and fear about something she referred to only as the presence in the house. It was clear that Eleanor believed this presence was aware of and responding to their actions, its intentions ambiguous, but its power growing. The final letter ended abruptly, with a hastily scribbled plea for her grandmother to remain vigilant and a cryptic instruction to find and seal the heart of the house before it was too late. Intrigued and alarmed, Sarah gathered the letters, tucking them into her pocket. She needed to understand what the heart of the house referred to and why it was so important. Her gaze drifted to the far end of the attic, to a heavy, draped cloth that covered what appeared to be a large painting or mirror. Something about it called to her, an inexplicable pull towards whatever lay beneath. As she approached, the air grew noticeably colder, her breath visible in the chilly attic. Reaching out, she pulled the cloth away, revealing an ornate, full-length mirror. Its frame was carved with intricate designs, symbols that seemed to shimmer slightly in the dim light. Sarah's reflection stared back at her, but as she moved, the surface rippled, distorting her image in unsettling ways. Suddenly, the wind intensified, howling around the eaves of the house as if angry or disturbed by the uncovering of the mirror. Sarah stepped closer, her hand hesitantly reaching out to touch the glass. The moment her fingertips brushed the surface, a surge of images flooded her mind. Visions of her grandmother in this very attic, chanting, a circle of candles around her, and shadows, so many shadows, swirling around the room. Shaken, Sarah stumbled back. The mirror was more than it seemed. It was a gateway or a repository of some kind, connected deeply to the house and possibly to the presence Eleanor had written about. She needed to learn more about these rituals and the symbols on the frame. With renewed purpose, she covered the mirror again, the air growing warmer as the cloth obscured its surface. The rest of the morning was spent in the house's expansive library, where Sarah searched through her grandmother's collection of books on folklore, spiritualism, and the occult. Many of the books were old, the pages yellowed with age, but they contained a wealth of information about protective rituals and spiritual wards. It became clear that her grandmother had been a practitioner of some form of protective magic, deeply involved in safeguarding herself and the house from something otherworldly. As Sarah pieced together the information from the books and the letters, she understood that her grandmother had been part of a lineage of protectors, each tasked with keeping whatever resided in the house at bay. The mirror was likely a focal point for these energies, a tool used to both contain and interact with the spiritual presence. Determined to find more concrete answers, Sarah decided her next step was to explore the house's cellar. The one place she hadn't yet looked, and possibly the location Eleanor referred to as the heart of the house. Preparing herself for what she might find, she armed herself with a flashlight and an old key she found in the library that was labeled cellar. The house seemed to watch her as she descended the stairs to the ground floor, each step creaking ominously underfoot. The cellar door was in the kitchen, a solid wooden barrier that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Inserting the key into the lock, Sarah turned it, hearing the click of the mechanism as it unlocked. Taking a deep breath, she pulled the door open, a rush of cold, stale air greeting her. What lay beyond the door could hold the key to the mysteries of the house, to her family's secretive past, and to the very essence of the spectral disturbances that had haunted her since her arrival. With a mixture of fear and anticipation, Sarah stepped into the darkness of the cellar, ready to confront whatever awaited her there. The cellar was dark and damp, a stark contrast to the rest of the house. As Sarah descended the creaking wooden steps, her flashlight beam sliced through the blackness, revealing stone walls and a dirt floor. Cobwebs clung to the corners of the room, and an earthy, musty smell permeated the air. The temperature dropped with each step she took, sending shivers up her spine, not entirely due to the cold. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, Sarah swept her light across the cellar. It was largely empty, save for a few old wine racks and some broken furniture piled up against one wall. Her heart raced as she moved deeper into the cellar, her senses heightened to every sound. The drip of water, the flutter of a disturbed spider web, the whisper of the wind through the cracks above. Her flashlight landed on a peculiar sight. An old wooden chest, its surface dulled by time but still intact, tucked away under the staircase. It wasn't locked, just dusty and forgotten. Curiosity piqued. Sarah knelt before it, pausing for a moment before lifting the heavy lid. Inside, she discovered a pile of old books, some leather-bound, others barely holding together, and a smaller, more ornate journal on top. This journal, unlike those found in her grandmother's bedroom, was adorned with strange symbols on the cover, similar to those on the mirror in the attic. With bated breath, Sarah opened the journal. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. It was her grandmother's handwriting again, but these entries were different. They were more personal, filled with fear and determination. The journal detailed her grandmother's struggle with the presence in the house, how it grew stronger with each generation, and how her grandmother had learned to contain it. The diary also mentioned a network of other practitioners who had helped to reinforce the protective spells and wards around the property. As Sarah read, she could almost hear her grandmother's voice, echoing through the cellar, whispering the words off the page. It was a detailed account of how the mirror served as a barrier and a gateway, meant to keep the entity at bay while also allowing her grandmother to communicate and negotiate with it. The journal outlined specific rituals, some of which required the mirror, others that utilized the unique architecture of the house itself, particularly the cellar. The more she read, the more Sarah understood the magnitude of what her grandmother had been dealing with. It wasn't just about protecting the physical house. It was about safeguarding their family's souls from corruption or possession. The diary described one particular ritual that seemed to be central, a binding ritual, meant to be performed once every generation. The last entry was dated just a few weeks before her grandmother's death, a hurried note that mentioned the need to pass on the knowledge and prepare the next guardian. With a heavy heart, Sarah realized that this responsibility had now fallen to her. She felt a mix of awe and terror, knowing the dangers involved, but also feeling a deep connection to her grandmother and a duty to continue her work. The diary also contained a loose map of the house, annotated with various symbols and notes. Sarah studied this map carefully, tracing her fingers over the pathways her grandmother had drawn. It showed a hidden room in the cellar, marked with a symbol that matched one on the mirror's frame. Intrigued, Sarah shone her flashlight around the cellar, looking for any signs of this hidden space. After several minutes of searching, she found a section of the stone wall that seemed slightly different from the rest. It was smoother, and upon closer inspection, it appeared to be a cleverly disguised door. There was no obvious way to open it, but recalling the symbols in the diary, Sarah pressed her hand against the stone where the corresponding symbol was drawn. To her astonishment, the stone shifted under her touch, revealing a narrow opening. Heart-pounding, Sarah stepped through into the hidden room. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of herbs and incense. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of strange ingredients, old bones, and artifacts. In the center of the room stood a large stone altar, atop which lay another, much older journal, and several unusual objects that seemed to be ritualistic tools. Sarah approached the altar, her hands trembling as she picked up the ancient journal. This one seemed to date back even further, possibly a record from the original builder of the house or an earlier ancestor who had first encountered the presence. As she opened it, the house seemed to settle around her, as if it were acknowledging her readiness to take up the mantle. With the storm still raging outside, Sarah began to read, determined to uncover all the secrets held within the walls of her family home. Each page turned drawing her deeper into the history of her lineage and the supernatural legacy she was born into. The ancient journal Sarah held was brittle to the touch, its cover a tapestry of intricate leatherwork that whispered of age-old secrets. The pages inside were delicate, each turn requiring a gentle touch to avoid crumbles. The writing was in a hand unfamiliar to Sarah, the script elegant but dense, narrating a saga of early settlers entwined with the land's original spirits. The journal began with the account of an ancestor named Eliza, who first settled on the land where the house now stood. Eliza wrote of a deep, unexplainable connection to the land and of discovering an ancient spirit dwelling within it. She described her initial fear, which turned into a pact. She would protect the spirit's resting place, and in return, the spirit would safeguard her descendants. This symbiotic relationship had carried through generations, with each new guardian learning the ways of the spirits and the land. As Sarah delved deeper into the text, the storm outside seemed to echo the intensity of the events described on the faded pages. Eliza's entry spoke of constructing the house, intentionally incorporating symbols and wards within its architecture as protections and bindings. The cellar and the attic, where the mirror was placed, were focal points of spiritual energy, channels through which the earthly and spectral realms could communicate. Eliza's descriptions were vivid, filled with accounts of nights spent in the attic, speaking to the whispers through the mirror, learning the names of the spirits and the spells required to bind them. These entries were interspersed with sketches of the mirror and diagrams of the rituals, which seemed almost alive, the ink dark and potent even after centuries. The sound of the wind grew louder, a howling that seemed almost to call Sarah's name, urging her to read on. Her fingers traced the lines of a particularly detailed sketch of a ritual involving the mirror, the full moon, and a ring of salt. The margin held a warning in Eliza's shaky script: "Beware the unbound spirit, for it seeks to break the chains of control and wreak havoc upon the land." Absorbed in the journal, Sarah nearly jumped when she heard a distinct knock on the cellar door. Heart pounding, she listened as it came again, more insistent this time. A cold draft swept through the room, sending shivers down her spine. The candles she had lit flickered violently, casting long, dancing shadows against the stone walls. Yet, compelled by the urgency of unlocking her family's mysteries, she stood, placing the journal carefully on the altar. Sarah approached the cellar door cautiously, the old wood feeling colder than usual under her fingertips. She opened it slowly, half expecting to find someone or something from the other side of the spiritual veil waiting for her. Instead, the door revealed only the familiar surroundings of the house, though the air felt charged, as if the storm outside had seeped into the very fabric of the building. Returning to the hidden room, Sarah felt a resolve stealing within her. She gathered the ritualistic tools laid out on the altar, a silver dagger, a bundle of dried herbs, and a small, crystal vial filled with a liquid that shimmered under the candlelight. Each item was labeled with instructions in the same hand as the journal, providing guidance for their use. As she organized the items, Sarah's mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. She needed to perform the ritual to reaffirm the bindings that kept the spirits at bay, a responsibility that now rested solely on her shoulders. The whispers in the wind seemed to sense her decision, their tone shifting from eerie moans to something resembling encouragement or perhaps urgency. Determined to protect her ancestral home and maintain the balance her family had upheld for generations, Sarah prepared herself. She reread the ritual instructions, each word embedding itself in her memory. The ritual would need to be performed that night, under the stormy sky, as the conditions mirrored those described in Eliza's entries for the most potent bindings. With the house seeming to breathe around her, Sarah stepped out of the hidden room, the ancient journal and tools in hand. She made her way to the attic, the heart of the spiritual activity, to set up for the ritual. As she ascended the stairs, the shadows seemed to move with her, the whispers growing louder, now clear and distinct. Reaching the attic, she found the mirror as she had left it, covered and undisturbed. She arranged the candles in a circle around it, placed the salt in a precise ring as instructed, and laid out the other tools. The storm raged on, a fitting backdrop for the night's task. As twilight deepened into night, Sarah began her preparations in earnest, the house and the spirits watching, waiting to see if she would succeed in her role as the new guardian. As twilight bled into darkness, the storm outside reached a feverish intensity. Sarah positioned the last of the candles around the attic, their flames casting eerie, flickering shadows against the walls. She stood before the mirror, the heavy cloth still covering it, feeling the weight of her ancestors' eyes upon her. With a steady hand, she removed the cover, revealing the ornate mirror once again. Its surface shimmered slightly, as if anticipating the impending ritual. Sarah took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. She placed the silver dagger, the dried herbs, and the crystal vial on a small table she had set up beside the mirror. The air around her felt charged, electric with unseen energies. She could almost hear the whisper of her grandmother guiding her, reinforcing the gravity of her task. Opening the ancient journal to the page detailing the ritual, Sarah began to meticulously lay out the circle of salt around herself and the mirror, creating a protective barrier. The salt crunched softly under her feet as she moved, each step deliberate and measured. Once the circle was complete, she lit the bundle of herbs, the smoke rising and filling the room with a pungent, earthy aroma. With the stage set, Sarah took the silver dagger and carefully cut her palm, just enough to draw blood. The pain was sharp, a stark reminder of the reality of her actions. She let a few drops fall into the crystal vial, which already contained a clear liquid. As her blood mingled with the liquid, it took on a luminescent quality, glowing faintly in the dim light of the attic. Reciting the words from the journal, Sarah began the ritual. She spoke each word clearly, her voice steady despite the howling wind and the thunderous booms from outside. The mirror began to react, its surface rippling like the surface of a disturbed pond. Shadows danced across it, forming and reforming into shapes she could barely comprehend. As she continued the incantation, the air in the attic grew colder, the temperature dropping so sharply that her breath became visible, misting in the cold air. The candles flickered wildly, as if struggling against an unseen force trying to snuff them out. Sarah felt a presence building in the room, a pressure against her chest that made it hard to breathe. With one final recitation, Sarah poured the glowing liquid from the vial into the fire of the burning herbs. A brilliant light erupted from the flames, illuminating the entire attic in a blinding flash. She shielded her eyes with her arm, feeling the heat wash over her, the energy pulsing through the room. When the light subsided, Sarah lowered her arm and opened her eyes. The mirror's surface was calm again, the shadows gone. But the reflection now showed not just her own image, but also that of another figure standing beside her. Her grandmother, clear as day, though slightly translucent. Sarah gasped, stepping back in shock, her heart pounding in her chest. Her grandmother's apparition smiled gently, a look of pride and gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you, Sarah." Her grandmother's voice echoed softly around the room, warm and familiar. "You have done well to bind the spirit again. But remember, this is only a part of what keeps it at bay. The true strength lies in understanding and balance. Her grandmother's form began to fade, her image dissipating into the air like mist. "Do not fear the spirits," she whispered, her voice fading with her image. "Learn from them, and live with them in harmony." As the last vestige of her grandmother's presence vanished, Sarah stood alone in the attic, the storm outside suddenly quieting. The oppressive pressure in the room lifted, and she could breathe easily again. The sense of peace was palpable, as if the house itself were settling, its long-held breath finally released. Sarah took a moment to absorb everything that had happened. Her body trembled, not just from the cold, but also from the realization of the power and responsibility she had inherited. She gathered the ritual tools, carefully storing them as her grandmother's journal had instructed, knowing they were to be used by future generations. As she descended the attic stairs, her steps were light, almost ethereal. The house was silent now, respectful of its new guardian. Sarah felt a profound connection to her grandmother and to the long line of women who had protected this home. She knew she was part of something much larger than herself, a lineage of guardians whose lives were intricately woven with the spirits they bound. Back in her grandmother's bedroom, Sarah took one last look at the journals on the nightstand. She felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment and duty. Her journey had just begun, and she was ready to embrace whatever came next, armed with the knowledge and strength of her ancestors. The first rays of dawn filtered through the curtains as Sarah emerged from the attic, the night's events leaving a surreal impression on her mind. The house was silent now, a sacred quiet that felt like a reverent acknowledgement of the night's ritual. Sarah moved through the hallway, each step echoing softly on the hardwood floor. She felt lighter, as if a great burden had been lifted, not just from her shoulders but from the house itself. Descending the staircase, Sarah paused halfway, looking back over her shoulder at the quiet expanse of the old house. The storm had ceased, the early morning light painting the walls with a soft, warm glow. In this new light, the house no longer seemed menacing or filled with unseen threats. Instead, it felt like a sanctuary, a guardian itself of not just spirits but of generations of her family's history. Entering the kitchen, Sarah prepared herself a cup of tea. The familiar ritual felt comforting, grounding her after the night filled with ancient rites and spectral presences. Sitting at the old wooden table, she reflected on her grandmother's words, the advice to live in harmony with the spirits, to learn from them. It seemed her role was not just to bind or to protect, but to understand and coexist. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the front door. Surprised, Sarah set her tea down and walked to the door, curious who could be visiting at such an early hour. Swinging the door open, she found Mr. Donnelly, her grandmother's old friend and neighbor, standing on the porch with a concerned look on his face. "Good morning, Sarah. I saw the storm last night, quite fierce. Just wanted to check in and see if everything was all right here," Mr. Donnelly said, his eyes scanning the house behind her as if expecting to see signs of distress. Sarah smiled, reassured by the normalcy his visit brought. "Good morning, Mr. Donnelly. Yes, it was quite a storm, but we're all fine here. Thank you for checking in." Mr. Donnelly nodded, looking relieved. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman, did many good things for this old place. I see she's left it in capable hands." His words warmed Sarah, affirming her new sense of connection to her grandmother and her responsibilities. They chatted for a few more minutes before Mr. Donnelly bid her goodbye, promising to return if she ever needed anything. Closing the door, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that the night's events were just the beginning of her deeper engagement with the legacy she had inherited. The journals, the rituals, the spirits, all were parts of a larger tapestry she was now woven into. Returning to the kitchen, Sarah picked up her tea and walked over to the large window that overlooked the garden. The land stretched out beyond the house, lush and vibrant in the morning light, the trees and flowers unbothered by the storm's fury. It struck her then how deeply rooted her family was to this place, how each generation had tended not just to the physical building but to the land itself. Inspired, Sarah made a decision. She would not only continue her grandmother's work inside the house, but would also revive the gardens and grounds, restoring them to their former glory as her ancestors had intended. It would be her way of honoring the pact made all those years ago, a living tribute to the harmony between the natural and the spiritual. Over the next few weeks, Sarah immersed herself in this task. She started by clearing the overgrowth, then planting new flowers and herbs, many of which had spiritual significance, according to her grandmother's journals. She repaired the old stone pathways and installed new benches, envisioning a place where she could meditate and connect with both her ancestors and the spirits. As the garden came to life under her care, Sarah felt a deep, fulfilling peace. She often paused in her work to look up at the house, half expecting to see her grandmother watching from the window, her presence a comforting reminder of the cycle of care and guardianship that now included Sarah. The transformation was not just in the land, but in Sarah herself. She felt rooted, like the old oak tree that stood sentinel over the property. Her nights were no longer filled with uncertainty and fear of the unknown. Instead, they were times of reflection, learning, and occasional whispered conversations through the mirror, now a familiar ritual that she approached with respect and a willing heart. One evening, standing in the newly restored garden, Sarah looked back at the house. The sunset painted it in hues of gold and pink, the windows reflecting the brilliant colors of the sky. The house no longer seemed like just a structure. It was a living, breathing entity filled with stories, secrets, and life. She knew her journey was just beginning, that there would be challenges ahead, but she also knew she was never alone. Her grandmother's legacy was now hers to build upon, a legacy of balance, understanding, and respect for all things seen and unseen. With a calm smile, Sarah turned back to her garden, ready to nurture the land as it had nurtured her, standing strong as the new guardian of a very old pact.